The first thing you would notice is the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but a vast, pressing stillness. Like the world is holding its breath. You stand on unfamiliar ground, the air heavier than you expect, thick with warmth and moisture. The sky above you is not the soft blue you know, but deeper, richer, almost ancient in its hue. The sun hangs larger, brighter, casting long shadows that seem to stretch with intention. You have woken up in a world before humans ruled. There are no cities, no roads, no monuments carved in stone, no voices speaking language as you know it. Yet this world is far from empty. It hums with life. Dense, overwhelming, watching. You feel it immediately. You are not at the top of the food chain here. The land stretches endlessly, covered in towering forests unlike any on Earth today. Trees rise hundreds of feet into the sky, their trunks thick as towers, their canopies forming a ceiling that filters the light into a perpetual twilight. The air smells alive, rich soil, resin, warm water, decay and growth intertwined. Every step you take feels intrusive, as if the ground itself is aware of you. In this age, survival is not a given. It is a question asked every moment. This is a world shaped long before human dominance, before language defined reality, before memory became history. A world where nature is not tamed, negotiated with, or romanticized. It simply is, and it does not care if you belong. You move forward cautiously. The ground vibrates faintly beneath your feet. Not an earthquake, but something else. A rhythm, a pulse. Far away, something massive shifts its weight. You cannot see it yet, but your body knows it is there. This is the age when giants still walk. Not giants of fairy tales, but enormous life forms shaped by deep time. Creatures adapted to an earth richer in oxygen, warmer, more volatile. Insects the size of birds. Reptilian forms that move with slow, deliberate power. Mammals still experimenting with what they might become. And somewhere among them, early ancestors of humanity struggled to survive. Not rulers, not conquerors, but observers hiding in the margins of a world that does not belong to them. The sky darkens slightly as clouds gather, thick and heavy. Storms here are not gentle. Rain falls in sheets, pounding the earth, reshaping the land in hours. Rivers swell and carve new paths overnight. Mountains are younger, more unstable. The planet is still in motion, still forming itself. This is not a world built for comfort. It is a testing ground. You begin to understand something unsettling. Survival here is not about intelligence alone. It is about timing, about awareness, about knowing when not to be seen. In the distance, something moves through the trees. You don't see it directly, only the way the canopy trembles, how birds erupt into flight, how the ground responds as if something enormous has passed through. Your instinct screams at you to hide, and you do. Crouched behind thick roots, heart pounding, you realize how fragile the human body truly is. No tools, no fire, no shelter, no language to call for help. In this world, even sound is dangerous. This is what the planet looked like before it learned our name. Time here moves differently, not in hours or days, but in ages. Entire species rise and vanish without ceremony. Survival is not a story, it is a temporary condition. And yet, even here, life persists with astonishing creativity. Small mammal-like creatures scurry through undergrowth, adapting, learning, changing. Some climb, some burrow. Some evolve sharper senses, faster reflexes. Evolution is not gentle, but it is patient. You begin to understand that this world is not hostile out of cruelty. It is indifferent. It does not reward morality or intention, only adaptation. Above you, the sky darkens again, not with storm clouds, but with something else. Ash, dust, a haze that filters the sun into a dull copper glow. The temperature drops slightly, the air thickens. This is a moment many will never remember, yet it will change everything. Long before humans ever told stories, the earth itself was already writing one. Deep beneath the surface, forces move. Tectonic plates grind slowly, rearranging continents. Volcanic activity releases gases that alter the climate. Oceans rise and fall. Ice begins to form at the poles. The world is shifting towards something new, something colder, something less forgiving. and life must respond or vanish. Some do. Insects disappear. Massive reptiles fade from dominance. Entire lineages quietly end, leaving only fragments buried in stone. There is no ceremony for extinction, no warning, only absence. And still life continues. Small, adaptable creatures begin to thrive in the shadows of giants. They learn to hide, to wait, to endure. Intelligence does not yet rule, but awareness begins to sharpen. You watch as one such creature pauses, lifts its head and looks directly toward you. For a moment there is recognition, not recognition of you as a person, but as a presence. Something out of place. A ripple moves through your chest. A question forms, unspoken but heavy. What if this is where we truly began, not as masters, but as survivors? The world trembles again. Far away, something collapses with a sound like thunder. The air grows colder, the light dims. You sense that this moment, this fragile balance, is about to break. The age of giants is nearing its end. But what comes next will not be gentler. And humanity, still fragile and unformed, will have to face a truth it was never meant to know. A truth buried not in myth, but in time itself. The ground beneath your feet shifts, and the world holds its breath. The ground does not break all at once. It groans first, slow, almost thoughtful, like something ancient turning in its sleep. Then the tremor spreads outward, subtle enough to question whether it was ever real. But the animals know, they always know. From the undergrowth, silence spreads in widening circles. Birds vanish into the canopy. Insects freeze mid-song. Even the wind seems to pause as if listening. You feel it again, that sensation that the world is not merely a setting, but a presence. Watching, measuring. This is not the end of an age yet. It is the warning before it. Far beyond the horizon, tectonic plates grind against one another with unimaginable force. Pressure builds in chambers beneath the crust, molten rock seeking release. The planet is adjusting its balance, correcting an instability that has been growing for millions of years. And life, unaware of the calculations beneath its feet, continues forward, blind to the approaching correction. You walk through the forest as light begins to fade into amber. The air thickens with moisture, carrying scents both sweet and metallic. Somewhere, something large exhales. The sound is low, resonant, almost mournful. Then you see it. A creature stands at the edge of a clearing, half shrouded by mist. Its size is difficult to comprehend, not because it is monstrous, but because it seems deliberate. Every movement is slow, economical, shaped by millions of years of refinement. Its body carries scars not from battle, but from time itself. Survival etched into bone. This is not a predator in the human sense. It does not hunt for pleasure. It exists to endure, and it is not alone. Across this world, countless forms of life are locked into silent negotiation with their environment. Some grow larger, others smaller. Some retreat underground, others take to the air. Evolution is not progress, it is response. You begin to realize something unsettling. Intelligence is not inevitable. Human consciousness, the reflective mind, the urge to record, to remember, to question, was never guaranteed. It is a narrow path carved through countless failures, a statistical anomaly walking on borrowed time. In this age, intelligence has not yet chosen its vessel. Night falls quickly here. Stars appear sharper, closer, unfiltered by pollution or myth. The sky feels heavy with memory. Constellations do not yet carry names. They are simply patterns, meaningless until someone decides they are not. As darkness deepens, the temperature drops. Fog creeps low across the ground, blurring the line between earth and air. Somewhere in the distance, a roar echoes, deep, resonant, final. It is not a challenge, it is a declaration. Territory. You feel small, not insignificant, but temporary. In the shadows, early mammals huddle, together for warmth. Their hearts beat fast, their lives measured in moments of awareness between danger. They do not dream of the future, they dream only of the next breath. And yet, within them, something is stirring, not thought, not language, potential. Far above, the sky shifts again. A faint streak of light tears across the atmosphere, brief, brilliant, then gone. A meteor burning itself away before it can touch the surface. Another reminder that this planet exists within a much larger story, one written in cosmic timescales. Somewhere, deep beneath the crust, pressure continues to rise. Volcanoes that have slept for millennia begin to stir. The chemistry of the atmosphere subtly changes. Carbon levels fluctuate. Oceans warm, then cool. Currents shift. Ice begins to form where none existed before. These are not catastrophes yet. They are preparations. Life responds as it always has, not with foresight, but with variation. Some species migrate, others adapt, many simply disappear, leaving no trace except chemical ghosts locked in stone. Extinction in this world is not a failure, it is a mechanism. And humanity, still unborn in any recognizable form, is unknowingly approaching its first great trial. As the climate cools, forests thin. Open plains begin to emerge. Predators that once thrived in dense cover struggle. New hunters appear, faster, leaner, more coordinated. The balance shifts. You witness a moment that will never be recorded, yet will echo through millions of years. A small, upright creature pauses at the edge of a clearing, stands on two legs just a moment longer than necessary, and looks around not in fear, but in calculation, a fragile spark. Not intelligence yet, but intention. This world is shaping minds without knowing it. Storms grow more violent. Seasons grow harsher. Food becomes harder to find. The planet is tightening its grip, forcing life to choose between change or extinction. And somewhere within this pressure, something awakens. A capacity not just to survive, but to remember. You feel it in the air now. A tension, like a story gathering its first words. The giants are fading. Their era is ending not with a single cataclysm, but with a slow, inevitable decline. They were too large, too specialized, too dependent on stability. The future belongs to the adaptable, to the ones who can think in uncertainty. The night deepens, the stars burn cold and distant, the ground cools beneath your feet, and for the first time you sense that this world is preparing to hand itself over to something smaller, weaker, and far more dangerous. Because unlike the giants, this new presence will remember, it will imagine, it will ask questions, and one day it will wonder where it came from. The wind shifts again, carrying with it the echo of something not yet born, but already inevitable. The age of dominance is ending, the age of awareness is approaching, and when it arrives, nothing will ever be the same. The silence after extinction is never empty. It hums, faintly, patiently, like the echo of a world trying to remember itself, long after the great shapes vanished, long after the thunder of colossal footsteps faded into sediment. The planet breathed differently, lighter, quieter, yet more tense than ever before. Life had survived, but it had been reshaped by loss. The sky above this new world looked wider somehow, the air clearer, the stars sharper, as if the universe itself were leaning closer, curious to see what would rise from the ruins. In the open plains, where once forests towered and giants roamed, smaller beings now moved with nervous precision. Their bodies were fragile compared to the titans that came before them, but within their fragility was a new kind of power, flexibility. They could adapt. They were not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most armoured, but they were observant. They learned to wait. They learned to watch patterns in the wind, in the clouds, in the movements of other creatures. Survival was no longer about brute strength. It was about anticipation, and anticipation, quietly, is the beginning of thought. The planet continued its slow transformation. Continents shifted by millimetres that would become miles. Oceans crept forward, then retreated. Glaciers formed and melted like long, patient breaths. With each cycle, life was tested again and again. Most failed, but a few endured. In the shadows of rock formations, beneath the shelter of twisted roots, small groups began to organize, not by instinct alone, but by memory. They remembered which valleys flooded, which plants poisoned, which calls meant danger. Memory became inheritance, and inheritance became identity. Time passed in stretches no mind could measure. tens of thousands of years folded into one another, invisible to those living them. Yet slowly, almost imperceptibly, bodies changed, limbs lengthened, fingers grew more dexterous, eyes began to track movement with intention, not reflex. And then, one quiet evening, something extraordinary happened. A creature picked up a stone, not to throw it in fear, not to chew it in hunger, but to use it. The stone fit the curve of its palm. It struck another rock experimentally. Sparks jumped. A sound echoed, sharp, surprising. The creature froze, heart racing, eyes wide. Nothing attacked. It struck again. And in that moment, the world tilted. This was not instinct. This was experimentation. Fire would come much later, but this was its ancestor. Curiosity made physical. The realization that the world could be changed, not just endured. That moment did not echo across the land. No thunder marked it, no sky split open. But in the deep fabric of time, it was louder than any extinction, because from that moment on, the planet was no longer shaping life alone. Life had begun shaping the planet. Generations passed, bodies refined, minds sharpened, social bonds strengthened, not merely for survival, but for shared meaning. Sounds turned into patterns, patterns into symbols, symbols into the first fragile threads of language. And with language came memory beyond the individual. Stories, not yet myths, but recollections, warnings, lessons etched into behaviour. The night fires grew more common. Faces flickered in orange light. Shadows danced against cave walls, stretching into shapes that looked almost alive. And in those shadows imagination awakened. The world was no longer just what was seen, it was what was believed. Somewhere deep within these early minds a question formed for the first time, not spoken but felt. Why? Why does the sky move? Why does death come? Why do we think? The question had no answer yet, but it would not disappear. It would echo through millennia, carving pathways in thought as surely as rivers carve stone. Above them, the stars watched silently. Patterns shifted slowly, imperceptibly, marking the passage of ages. Cosmic cycles continued, indifferent yet intimately connected. And beneath those stars, something unprecedented was unfolding. Not a species yet, a possibility, a consciousness in its infancy, staring into the dark not with fear alone, but with wonder. The earth had given birth to many rulers before, but this one was different. This one would question its own existence. This one would look backward and forward and someday ask if it was alone. And somewhere in the deep memory of the planet, the echoes of lost worlds waited, not dead but dormant, ready to resurface when the questions grew dangerous enough, because the greatest transformations were still ahead, and they would not come from the sky, they would come from within the mind. The early mornings were no longer merely about survival. They had become a time of observation, of learning the language of the land. Each leaf that trembled, each insect that darted, each ripple in the river spoke volumes. Those who listened began to understand rhythm, cause and effect, the subtle dialogue between predator and prey. It was in this silence that intelligence quietly sharpened, not through instruction or design, but through necessity. The giants had disappeared, and the earth had become a testing ground for a new kind of life, smaller, fragile, yet endlessly adaptable. Every misstep carried a lesson. Every success was amplified through memory and repetition. One such creature, slight and cautious, moved along the banks of a swollen river. Its fur was damp, clinging to a lean body that had learned to conserve energy. It sniffed the wind, ears twitching at the faintest of sounds. Somewhere upstream, a predator lurked, massive but unseen. Yet the small creature's instincts had grown sharper. It paused, tilted its head, and considered not fleeing immediately, but how to manipulate the environment to its advantage. A stick became a tool, a stone a shield. It was a new awareness, the beginning of strategy, the ability to imagine not just the present, but multiple possible outcomes. This was intelligence still in infancy, but it was powerful. Time pressed onward. Seasons shifted faster than they seemed capable of observing. Forests thinned, rivers dried, and new predators emerged from niches previously unexplored. Adaptation became a race against inevitability. Every generation had to refine its senses, its behaviors, its cooperation. Survival alone was insufficient. Innovation was now mandatory. Across the plains, small social groups began forming. They were rudimentary, fragile, yet functional. Cooperation emerged, not because of morality, but because it worked. Tasks were shared, observations communicated, patterns noted. A simple gesture could communicate far more than instinct alone ever could. Slowly, a network of knowledge was forming, connecting individuals across space and time. Meanwhile, storms grew fiercer, reshaping the landscape with indifferent power. Volcanoes erupted without warning, forests ignited, rivers surged. Each catastrophe became a new problem to solve. And each solution refined the capabilities of those who survived. It was during one such storm that a pivotal moment occurred. Lightning struck a tree and split it in two, the sound deafening yet precise. From the safety of a nearby cave, the small group of creatures observed. They noted the effect, the fire, the transformation of wood into ash, the sudden scarcity of shelter and food. One among them reached out, tentative, and manipulated a fallen branch into a barrier. Another observed and mirrored the action. The fire was controlled, not tamed, but harnessed enough to provide warmth and security. It was rudimentary, but it represented the first glimmer of what humans would one day call culture. The realization that the world could be engaged with, not merely endured. That reality could be influenced by action and understanding. As night fell, the cave became a sanctuary. Faces reflected in firelight, eyes wide and aware, tracing the movements of one another and of the shadows on the wall. Storytelling had not yet formed words, but it had formed gesture, mimicry, and observation. Memory extended beyond individual experience, passing across generations. Lessons became tradition, lessons became myth. Above them, the stars wheeled silently, indifferent witnesses to the slow construction of thought. Constellations shifted imperceptibly, marking cycles, eclipses, and changes. One night, a falling star streaked across the horizon, catching the attention of the small group. They watched not in fear, but with fascination, sensing a connection to forces larger than themselves. The first stirrings of wonder. The world remained harsh. Ice crept from polar regions, pushing climate belts and forcing adaptation. Large predators prowled with efficiency, taking advantage of any lapse in vigilance. But the small, adaptable creatures were beginning to outmaneuver, to anticipate, to manipulate the environment in subtle ways. Intelligence, emerging slowly, was beginning to tip the scales, in favor of foresight over brute strength. And yet, even as these early cognitive powers developed, the Earth still held secrets. Deep ocean trenches hid creatures of impossible size. Volcanic fissures breathed gases capable of reshaping the climate. And from the far reaches of the planet, silent shifts in tectonic plates threatened to reorder continents, subtly but inexorably. Each event was a challenge, a reminder that survival was not guaranteed, and that awareness alone would not suffice. In one quiet moment, as the storm subsided, the group ventured from the cave. They explored the newly scarred landscape, noting which paths were safe, which plants were edible, which rocks could provide leverage. Observation and memory intertwined. Every action became data, every reaction a lesson. And somewhere in that learning, in the calculation of risk, in the observation of cause and effect, something extraordinary was taking place. The first true spark of intentional thought. Not survival instinct alone, but curiosity, imagination, the primitive architecture of planning. It was small, fragile, easily extinguished, but it was real, and the world was about to challenge it again, because survival alone was no longer enough. The pressures of climate, predators, and environmental change would demand not only adaptation, but creativity, foresight, and ultimately the birth of civilization's earliest impulses. The age of giants had ended, the age of adaptation had begun. But the age of thought, the deliberate shaping of the world through mind, was on the horizon, ready to awaken in the most unexpected way. And in that awakening, humanity's first ancestors would unknowingly prepare the stage for everything yet to come. The world, having shed its giants, was no longer defined by size or power, but by subtlety and patience. The creatures that had survived were smaller, quicker, and infinitely more cautious. Every decision carried consequences. Every misstep could mean death. Yet, within this precarious balance, something remarkable was unfolding, a growing awareness that the world could be observed, predicted, and even influenced. One morning, a thin mist settled over the valleys, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation. The small group of creatures moved cautiously along the riverbanks, their movements synchronized almost instinctively. They paused at the edge of a shallow pool, observing the ripples and reflections. The water, still and clear, mirrored the sky, the trees, and themselves. For the first time, reflection became more than a survival tool. It became a curiosity. They experimented. One touched the water and noticed the ripples, how one movement could influence another. A branch, when dropped, created patterns. A small stone, thrown carefully, displaced water predictably. It was rudimentary physics, yet to them it was revelation. Cause and effect, seen and manipulated, began to build an internal map of the world. The forest around them was alive with subtle signals. Birds communicated warnings. Insects moved in patterns that revealed the approach of predators, and the rustling of leaves hinted at unseen movement. The creatures learned to interpret these signs not merely as instinct but as information. Observation became intelligence, memory became a tool, and slowly the first glimmers of planning emerged. Night fell, bringing with it the cold and the shadows. The creatures huddled together in caves and hollowed trees, sharing warmth. They were no longer solitary survivors, they were a social unit. Cooperation had become essential, yet it went beyond instinct. A leader emerged, not through dominance but through knowledge. This one remembered better, noticed patterns others missed, and subtly guided the group's behavior. The seeds of hierarchy, the first structured social order, had appeared. Meanwhile, the world continued to change. Volcanic activity reshaped landscapes. Rivers changed courses overnight. Storms became more violent. Ice advanced from the poles, driving migration and forcing adaptation. Every generation was tested anew, and the fittest were not the strongest, but the cleverest. They learned to anticipate, to manipulate the environment, to cooperate strategically. Within these struggles, creativity began to flicker. A creature discovered that fire, naturally sparked from lightning or friction, could be approached, manipulated, and preserved. Another noticed that a sharp rock could break open a shell, releasing nutritious food. These were tiny steps, yet they represented an understanding that the world could be changed through action and thought. Above, the sky shifted. Celestial patterns moved slowly across the night, unnoticed by all but the most attentive. The stars themselves became markers of time, of cycles, of repetition. One creature, observing the phases of the moon, began to anticipate changes in tides and light. Measurement, even primitive, was emerging. Observation was extending beyond the immediate moment into the future. And yet, this awareness was fragile. Predators lurked. Sudden floods or wildfires could destroy everything in hours. Life balanced between curiosity and caution. The tension was constant, almost palpable. Each choice could lead to survival or oblivion. And in this tension, intelligence grew sharper. Across the landscape, small groups began to experiment with rudimentary shelters. Branches leaned against rock faces. Hollow logs became safe zones. Holes were dug for water storage or food concealment. Innovation was slow, iterative, and dangerous, but it was consistent. Every attempt, every success or failure was remembered and subtly passed down. Knowledge began to accumulate beyond the span of a single life. The creatures began to communicate in more complex ways. Calls became signals with context. Gestures gained specificity. Coordinated behavior became possible. Though not language yet, the foundation for symbolic communication was forming. Memory and learning were now collective rather than individual. In the distance, The remnants of a volcanic eruption reshaped the terrain. Lava flows, still glowing from recent activity, created natural barriers. Creatures hesitated, observing before crossing. The landscape itself had become an obstacle course, teaching patience, risk assessment, and timing. Every step taken was a test of understanding, not just instinct. A single observation became a turning point. One creature discovered that a fallen tree could serve as a bridge across a rushing stream. Another followed the same path, realizing that the structure could be used repeatedly. Innovation was contagious. Knowledge propagated. Small, deliberate acts now began to accumulate into culture. Night fell again, and as the creatures rested, a new tension arose. The earth itself was restless. Tectonic shifts rumbled beneath distant mountains. Weather patterns hinted at coming droughts. And somewhere beyond the valleys, other predators were moving. Survival was temporary, fleeting, but the ability to anticipate, to learn, and to cooperate had begun to redefine what life meant in this pre-human world. In this crucible, intelligence was no longer merely reactive. It was proactive. It sought patterns, manipulated the environment, and prepared for contingencies. A spark had been lit, fragile but persistent, that would eventually shape the destiny of the species that would become humanity. And as the first light of dawn touched the misty valleys, one question lingered in the shadows of thought. Unspoken but undeniable. What would life do when it realized it could change the world rather than merely endure it? The first light of dawn spilled across the valley, soft and hesitant, illuminating a world in transition. The shadows of the night lingered, but they were no longer just threats. They were teachers. Every shape in the landscape, every ripple in the water, every subtle shift in the wind became a source of knowledge. Life had begun to read the world with intention, not just reaction. Small creatures moved cautiously through the terrain, their senses sharpened by generations of survival. Every step, every glance was calculated. A slight sound in the underbrush could mean the difference between life and death. Yet within this constant vigilance there emerged something extraordinary, deliberate curiosity. A need to understand, to experiment, to shape outcomes rather than simply endure them. One of the more observant creatures paused by a fallen branch, noting its angle across a small stream. It tapped the wood with its paw, noting the sound, the vibration, and how it shifted when submerged. Another approached, mimicking the behavior. In this imitation, learning passed beyond instinct. It became intentional. Knowledge was now communal, transmitted through observation and repetition. The environment itself became a teacher. Floods carved new channels, revealing safer pathways. Fires cleared undergrowth, exposing hidden food sources. Predators adapted, forcing prey to anticipate, to cooperate, and to strategize. Each challenge reshaped behavior, selecting not for strength alone, but for perception, patience, and ingenuity. Across the plains, groups began to form rudimentary hierarchies. Leadership arose naturally based not on dominance, but on observation and decision-making. Those who remembered past dangers, who recognized patterns in the movements of prey and predators, guided others. They became the first architects of strategy, sowing the seeds of early social structures. Night fell, and with it came lessons in endurance. Stars wheeled overhead, a vast cosmic clock measuring cycles of time beyond comprehension. Some creatures noticed the patterns, timing movements according to light and shadow. They anticipated storms and migrations. Awareness stretched beyond the immediate, embracing future possibilities. In a rocky ravine, a small group discovered fire, its first interaction not through fear, but curiosity. Sparks from friction startled them at first, but slowly they began to understand the potential. Fire became warmth, protection, and experimentation. The ability to control an element of nature was a turning point, signaling the shift from mere survival to influence over the environment. Memory, once ephemeral, now held permanence. Observed techniques, successful strategies, and warnings of danger passed between individuals. Gestures became language. Sounds became signals. The first rudimentary culture was forming, built upon necessity, observation, and shared experience. Time accelerated imperceptibly. Ice advanced and retreated, altering ecosystems. Mountains rose and eroded, rivers shifted, and climates fluctuated. Every change tested the adaptability of life, weeding out the unprepared and refining the capable. Within these pressures, intelligence became an advantage greater than size or strength. Amid the challenges, creativity began to emerge. Tools were shaped not just to survive, but to manipulate, to experiment. Stones became hammers and scrapers. Sticks became levers and probes. Observation combined with experimentation formed the first rudimentary science, a way to interact with the world intentionally. Even as intelligence grew, danger was never absent. Predators lurked in ambush, floods arrived without warning, and fire could destroy as easily as protect. The balance between risk and reward became the foundation of decision-making. Survival required foresight. Innovation demanded courage. Life was learning its own limits and potentials simultaneously. As night deepened, the creatures gathered in sheltered areas, exchanging silent observations. They began to anticipate each other's actions, cooperate in new ways, and solve simple problems collectively. Memory extended beyond the individual, forming the earliest threads of community knowledge. And somewhere high in the trees, a single being paused, observing the horizon. The mind of this creature, though small, was beginning to question, to imagine, not yet language, not yet history, but a spark of self-awareness, the realization that the world was not just something to react to, but something that could be influenced. Above, the stars marked time, indifferent yet present, witnessing the slow awakening of a new kind of intelligence. This was the beginning of a profound shift. Life was learning to observe, to plan, to remember, and to communicate. The groundwork for civilization, for reflection and for imagination was quietly being laid, and in that fragile dawn of thought, one lingering question remained unspoken, yet unavoidable. If life can learn, anticipate, and influence the world, then what shape will it take when it realizes the full extent of its own power? The morning light crept slowly across the plains, illuminating a world that had begun to pulse with quiet intelligence. The giants were gone, their thunderous dominance replaced by subtlety and attentiveness. Life had learned patience, observation, and the art of survival through adaptation. And now it was beginning to learn something more profound, intention. In a shaded valley, a small group of creatures moved deliberately among fallen trees and shallow streams. Their motions were calculated, almost cautious, as though they understood that every choice shaped not only their survival, but their future. One paused, lifted a stick, and tested its weight and balance against a stone. Another observed, mimicking the action. What was instinct in the past had now transformed into experimentation. The air was thick with moisture, carrying the scent of decaying leaves, fertile soil, and distant smoke from lightning-struck vegetation. The environment itself seemed alive, speaking in whispers of sound and movement. Creatures that listened carefully began to understand patterns, where predators hid, where water would accumulate, and how storms shifted the land. Observation had become intelligence. Memory had become strategy. Across the landscape, social bonds were forming in ways never before possible. Individuals who remembered better guided the group, not through force, but through knowledge. Patterns were shared through gestures, sounds, and proximity. Cooperation became deliberate, innovation emergent. The first rudimentary culture was taking shape, rooted in necessity but evolving into something far greater. By midday, the valley became a classroom. A young creature noticed how rocks could be used to pry open nuts. Another discovered that fire, sparked by friction from dry wood, could provide warmth and protection. Each small experiment, each observation was recorded silently in the minds of others. Knowledge was accumulating, extending beyond a single life into a collective memory. Overhead, the sky stretched wide and unpolluted, stars beginning their cycle as night approached. Even in darkness, the creatures adapted. Night predators emerged, testing vigilance and coordination. Prey species learned to communicate more effectively, combining calls, gestures, and coordinated movements. Intelligence was proving its evolutionary value in real time. Meanwhile, tectonic shifts continued to shape the land. Rivers changed course, new mountains rose, valleys were carved by ice and water. Each environmental change presented a challenge, forcing adaptation. Creatures capable of learning, anticipating, and cooperating thrived. Those dependent on instinct alone perished quietly. Extinction was no longer random, it was selective. Amid this crucible, sparks of imagination emerged. One creature discovered that shadows could be manipulated, moving objects to create patterns in the light. Another realized that sound could be used to signal or coordinate. Play and experimentation, intertwined with survival, began forming the early foundations of problem-solving and creativity. As dusk fell, the small group gathered near a fire, newly sparked, its glow reflecting off attentive eyes. They shared warmth, shelter, and silent observations. Through these interactions, behaviors became standardized. Knowledge was no longer personal, it was social, communal. Early culture was emerging, not as art or religion yet, but as structured cooperation grounded in observation and foresight. The nights were long, and danger was constant. Lightning split trees, predators prowled unseen, and environmental extremes tested the limits of endurance. But the spark of awareness persisted, fragile yet resilient. Each generation added incremental knowledge, each experiment building on the last, gradually creating a framework for the emergence of higher cognition. And in the quietest moments, when the fire flickered and the wind rustled leaves, a deeper awareness began to stir. The creatures were beginning to anticipate not just the actions of others, or the threats of predators, but the consequences of their own choices. Cause and effect became tangible. Memory extended beyond the individual, patterns became strategy. Above, the stars rotated in their ancient cycles, watching as life stretched toward consciousness. The Earth was not simply a stage for survival anymore. It was a laboratory, and these small, adaptable beings were learning the rules. And one question lingered at the edge of thought. When life begins to understand itself and the world around it, what will it create, and what will it destroy in the process? The first light of dawn spilled across a landscape still raw from the constant reshaping of the earth. The rivers carved new channels overnight, while winds whispered through skeletal forests that had survived countless storms. The creatures that roamed these lands had grown sharper, not in strength, but in observation and adaptability. Every movement, every sound, every subtle vibration in the ground became a source of information, shaping behaviors and decisions in ways instinct alone could never achieve. A small group gathered near a shallow stream, their attention focused not just on immediate survival, but on experimentation. One delicate creature picked up a smooth stone, rolling it between its paws, testing weight and balance. Another mimicked the motion, learning without instruction. The concept of cause and effect was no longer abstract, it was tangible. From the manipulation of stones to the examination of plant textures, these early behaviors were forming the foundation of intentional innovation. The environment was a teacher of harsh but invaluable lessons. Forest fires cleared dense undergrowth, revealing hidden food sources and creating new paths. Predators evolved alongside the prey, demanding cooperation, strategy, and foresight. Survival had shifted from reflexive response to anticipation. Intelligence was emerging not as an abstract trait, but as a necessity. At twilight, the first sparks of fire were discovered. Small, uncontrolled, frightening at first, yet fascinating. A spark from friction startled the creatures. Fear was immediate, but curiosity lingered. Slowly they began to approach, to test boundaries, to learn. The ability to harness natural phenomena was being born, and with it, a new sense of control over their world. Communication began to evolve. Gestures became signals, vocalizations carried nuanced meaning, and shared observation created a collective memory. Knowledge extended beyond the individual. The group learned from each success and each failure, gradually constructing a rudimentary culture based on cooperation and foresight. The night sky revealed celestial patterns, their cycles unnoticed by most, but not by the most attentive. The position of the moon, the timing of stars, and subtle changes in light were being recorded in memory, forming the first understanding of time and rhythm. Anticipation grew sharper, extending beyond the immediate into days, weeks, and generations. Environmental pressures intensified, glacial movements reshaped valleys, volcanic eruptions altered landscapes, and rivers shifted unpredictably. Every generation faced new challenges, selecting for adaptability, intelligence, and creativity over brute strength. Life was being refined, not just to survive, but to influence the world intentionally. In a rocky outcrop, one creature experimented with a branch, learning to leverage it to reach fruit or dislodge obstacles. Another observed and improved upon the method. Innovation was iterative, cumulative, and social. These small steps represented more than survival. They were the beginnings of planning, problem-solving, and even rudimentary engineering. The nights were filled with tension. Predators prowled silently, storms raged unpredictably, and environmental extremes tested endurance. Yet, within this crucible, consciousness began to deepen. Curiosity, experimentation, and the drive to influence the environment marked the subtle emergence of intelligence as a dominant force. As dawn broke again, the small group ventured further, testing pathways, observing animal behavior, and experimenting with tools. Each discovery, each adaptation, carried lessons forward, extending memory and shaping collective knowledge. Life had begun to think, not just react, but anticipate, innovate, and cooperate on levels that would define the future of intelligent species. And beneath the stars, across valleys and rivers, the first stirrings of self-awareness began to pulse faintly. The understanding that the world was not merely endured but could be influenced was emerging in small, fragile minds. With every experiment, every observation, every calculated movement, life inched closer to the point where it could reflect on itself and the universe around it. The question was now inevitable, lingering at the edge of thought. If life can begin to understand itself and shape its surroundings, what will it ultimately become, and what hidden potential lies waiting in the shadows of time? As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the world seemed to hold its breath. A faint golden haze settled over the valleys, brushing the treetops and the banks of meandering rivers with soft light. It was a fragile calm, fleeting yet profoundly revealing. The creatures that had survived the eons of adaptation, storms, and shifting climates were no longer merely instinctive beings. Something new had emerged, a spark of deliberate intelligence that would forever alter the trajectory of life on Earth. This intelligence was subtle, quiet, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, yet it carried the weight of profound transformation. Among the rocks and moss, a small group moved cautiously yet with a newfound deliberation. Each movement, once driven purely by fear or hunger, now carried purpose. One of them paused to observe a cluster of insects, noting patterns of movement, timing, and interaction. Another carefully picked up a stone and tested its weight, rolling it across a shallow ditch to see how it disturbed the water and how it could be used to manipulate objects. These were rudimentary experiments, but they were the very essence of intentionality, the birth of cognition that went beyond reaction and survival. The environment itself seemed to respond to this heightened awareness. Subtle changes in the wind carried information. The rustle of leaves could be interpreted as predator or prey. Streams whispered the patterns of the terrain, and the shifting shadows of the sun marked time with uncanny precision. Over countless generations, these early observers began to understand not just the physical properties of the world, but its rhythms and cycles. Each observation was carefully integrated into a growing communal memory, a repository of knowledge that would outlive the individual. Nightfall brought with it both danger and opportunity. Predators, ever watchful, tested the small group's coordination and problem-solving abilities. But the creatures had learned to anticipate, to strategize, and to manipulate the environment in ways that even the largest predators could not. Fires sparked from lightning had become tools of warmth and protection. Stones were no longer just obstacles, they were tools, weapons, and instruments of experimentation. the line between passive survival and active manipulation of the world had begun to blur. Above, the stars wheeled silently, distant yet compelling. Their positions, once irrelevant, now began to serve as markers of time, guiding movement, feeding cycles, and shaping understanding of the seasons. The creatures were not aware of the full implications of their observations, but the seeds of astronomy, of chronology, and of predictive reasoning were being sown. The universe, vast and unyielding, was gradually being interpreted, mapped, and understood through persistent attention and collective memory. Through repeated trials and errors, innovation became the norm, rather than the exception. One creature discovered that a sturdy branch could serve as a lever, not only to access food, but also to shift obstacles blocking a path. Another realized that coordinated movements could drive predators away or secure resources more efficiently. These small victories, amplified by observation and shared learning, created a feedback loop. The smarter the group became, the more effective its actions, and the more likely it was to survive and propagate knowledge. In sheltered valleys, patterns of cooperation began to solidify. Leadership emerged not through brute force, but through insight and foresight. Those with the best observational skills, the sharpest memory, and the clearest understanding of cause and effect guided others, creating the first rudimentary social hierarchies. These early leaders were not tyrants. They were repositories of knowledge, guardians of communal intelligence. And the groups that embraced collaboration, rather than isolation, thrived. Yet the world remained harsh, indifferent, and volatile. Climate shifted unpredictably. Rivers carved new courses overnight, and volcanic eruptions reshaped the land in moments. Each environmental upheaval tested the creatures' adaptability. Some perished, forgotten by history, while others survived and learned. The survivors' intelligence became both their shield and their sword, allowing them to anticipate dangers, manipulate resources, and explore new territories. The raw crucible of Earth had refined them, not in strength alone, but in cognition, strategy, and foresight. As centuries passed, these adaptations coalesced into the first recognizable forms of culture. Gestures became signals, sounds developed nuance, and coordinated action transformed into communication. Knowledge was now shared, stored, and extended across generations. Tools were refined, not merely discovered. Stones were sharpened, branches shaped, fire harnessed. The environment, once an overwhelming force, began to be understood, navigated, and subtly influenced. Survival was no longer passive, it was interactive, deliberate, and increasingly sophisticated. The landscape itself became a canvas for observation and experimentation. Valleys, hills, and rivers were studied for patterns, seasonal changes, and the behavior of other species. The creatures learned to predict not only immediate threats but also the movements of water, the timing of storms, and the migration patterns of prey. Knowledge was no longer confined to individual experience, it was shared, tested, and refined collectively. Memory became a tool, not just for survival, but for shaping the future. Even the most ephemeral experiences were transformed into lessons. The way sunlight fell through branches, the rhythm of a river's flow, the behavior of clouds before a storm, all became sources of information. Observation and memory merged, forming a network of understanding that transcended instinct. Learning became deliberate, and intelligence was no longer an accident of evolution. It was an emergent force, shaping both individual behavior and group strategy. Amidst this growing consciousness, curiosity flourished. Creatures began to test limits, manipulate the world, and anticipate consequences. They explored caves, experimented with fire, and discovered that certain materials could be combined or modified to produce predictable results. Early experimentation was cautious, yet persistent, and it spread quickly through the social groups. Learning had become contagious. Knowledge passed not only through observation, but through imitation and repetition, setting the stage for the earliest forms of education. As night fell, A quiet tension pervaded the land. Predators lurked, weather shifted unpredictably, and the earth itself groaned with tectonic movements. Yet, within these pressures, the spark of intentional thought continued to grow. Awareness was no longer reactionary, it was proactive. Life was beginning to anticipate, to manipulate, and to engage with the environment on a conceptual level. This was the first glimmer of strategy, planning, and foresight, the cognitive foundations upon which civilizations would eventually rise. The small groups gathered near newly harnessed fire, sharing warmth and observation. Silent communication and subtle gestures formed a language of cooperation, coordination, and memory. Social bonds were reinforced, hierarchies solidified, and knowledge became collective property. The groundwork for culture, law, and community was being laid, not through conscious design, but through the necessity of survival and the natural emergence of intelligence. In these fragile, quiet moments, awareness deepened further. Creatures began to anticipate not only the actions of predators and peers, but the consequences of their own decisions. Tools, fire, and environmental manipulation became extensions of thought. Patterns emerged where chaos once reigned. Knowledge began to accumulate, and with it, a subtle confidence. Life was no longer purely at the mercy of circumstance. It was learning to shape its destiny. The earth, with all its dangers and mysteries, had become a laboratory of cognition. Observation, memory, cooperation, and experimentation formed the pillars of a nascent intelligence that would eventually dominate the planet. And yet, for all the progress, the world retained its enigmatic unpredictability. Catastrophes, shifts, and mysteries still awaited. Life had learned much, but it had not yet mastered the full complexity of the earth it inhabited. And in the quiet, a final revelation emerged. Intelligence was not merely about survival, it was about transformation. The creatures that had once relied solely on instinct were now shaping their environment, passing knowledge across generations, and building the foundations of culture, innovation, and civilization. They were no longer passive participants in the story of Earth. They were active agents, capable of observation, reasoning, and imagination. As dawn broke fully, painting the valleys and rivers with golden light, the stage was set for the future. What had begun as simple survival had evolved into deliberate interaction with the world. Life had become aware, curious, and capable. The spark of intentional thought, nurtured across millions of years, was now poised to ignite the journey of human ancestors. Civilization, technology, and culture, all traces of what was to come, lay quietly within these small, adaptive minds. And finally, as the sun rose higher, one enduring question remained, one that would echo through the millennia. If life can observe, learn, and shape its surroundings, then what possibilities exist when it begins to understand itself fully, to imagine, and to act with foresight? The age of giants had passed. The crucible of survival had refined intelligence, and the earth was ready to witness the rise of a species capable not just of enduring the world, but of reshaping it entirely. From these quiet valleys, the story of humanity was silently beginning, a journey of curiosity, courage, and the deliberate awakening of thought, destined to leave its mark on the universe. This marked the end of the forbidden narrative, the tale of a world before humans and the birth of intelligence that would eventually shape the destiny of all life.